Welcome to the Green Alliance podcast. We're the think tank dedicated to achieving ambitious leadership on the climate and nature emergency. I'm Nick Davies, Head of Climate Policy at Green Alliance, and today we're going to be lifting the hood on one of the most pressing challenges in the UK's journey to net zero emissions: transport. Transport touches all of our lives, whether we're commuting to work, visiting family and friends, or heading abroad on holidays. But transport's driving some big problems. It's responsible for around a third of the UK's climate-changing emissions, and it's the biggest cause of poor air quality in urban areas, which shortens the lives of tens of thousands of people every year. And congestion is slowing down our economy to the tune of £7.5 billion a year. And if all that wasn't bad enough, it's not so great with wildlife either. Roads sever habitats, and little bits of tyre and brake wear that break down on our roads get washed off our roads and into streams and rivers, polluting freshwater sources and harming biodiversity. Big news was breaking on transport last week as we recorded this podcast. On Friday, Louise Haigh resigned as Transport Secretary. She'd been the youngest member of the Cabinet and was highly regarded in the environmental community for her passion and energy and the ambitious agenda she was bringing forward on public transport, cycling and in defending the Zero Emission Vehicle mandate. This came only a day after she'd unveiled her vision for an integrated national transport strategy for England. It's going to join up rail and bus services with active travel and make it easier for people to get around without a car. Also came against the backdrop of car makers pressuring government to slow up the electric vehicle transition after struggling car maker Stellantis announced that it was closing a factory in Luton. Swindon South MP Heidi Alexander is the new Transport Secretary. She's got a wealth of experience of the transport brief as former Deputy Mayor of London for Transport, where she helped to bring the Elizabeth line into service and keep London's public transport network working during the COVID-19 pandemic. In this episode, we'll explore some of the key challenges and opportunities for tackling some of these problems, making our systems work both for people and for planet. We'll be talking to public transport campaigner Michael Solomon Williams from Campaign for Better Transport and cycling journalist and author Laura Laker. We'll also be talking to Rosie Allen and Johann Beckford from Green Alliance. Johann, this year's progress report from the government's independent climate advisors, the Climate Change Committee, said that electric car sales are now beginning to have a measurable impact on transport emissions. Are we on track with the transition to electric vehicles?
Well, that question is an interesting one to consider. Certainly, we are seeing the effects of the electric vehicle transition. So there are now almost 1.3 million battery electric cars in the fleet today, which is a really, really impressive number. Having said that, that's just under 4% of the total cars. So there is still some way to go, but the trajectory has been going in the right direction over the last few years. So back in 2020, we had about 6.6% of new car sales were electric, and last year that was about 16.5%. So the growth has been rapid. Unfortunately, that growth rate in the last year has slowed a little. So the Society of Motor Manufacturers and Traders have actually revised down their projections for total sales this year. And we've seen some sort of narratives that have suggested that EV sales are actually decreasing, but that actually isn't true. It's just the rate of growth hasn't necessarily been on trend in the way that we may have expected over the last few years. The government has pushed forward as this is a major priority for its climate agenda, and actually the previous government passed the Zero Emission Vehicle mandate, which is essentially a proportional quota system that's placed on the car manufacturers themselves. So this isn't placed on the consumers, but it is on the car manufacturers. So they have to sell an increasing proportion of their vehicles as fully zero emission. So the first year, which is this year, to be a 22% sales quota, and that will increase up to 80% in 2030, and then 100% of new sales, that is, in 2035.
Last week, there was a big debate about the Zero Emission Vehicle mandate. The company Stellantis announced that it was closing a factory in Luton and blamed the ZEV mandate. And the government says it's going to be consulting on new measures that may introduce more flexibilities into that mandate. Do you think manufacturers are right to blame the ZEV mandate? And what do you think the government should be doing about it now?
Well, it's important to first express sympathy with the workers that are going to be losing out because of this decision. But the connection that Stellantis has drawn here between the zero emission vehicle mandate and the closure is really a bit of a stretch. So There's been a number of headwinds that the industry has faced for some time now. So Stellantis themselves were citing Brexit not too long ago. China is obviously a big threat to legacy car makers with the number of cheap EVs that they can export. And actually, the lack of a coherent industrial strategy in the UK for a number of years has meant that actually making vehicles here has been a challenge. But the regulatory environment in a broader sense really isn't the major challenge here, because actually the markets that many of the car manufacturers export to, the EU, for example, have very similar regulations in place. And so there is this expectation that we move towards electric vehicles has been set for some time. When it comes to the zero emission vehicle mandate, there are a number of flexibilities already in the legislation that actually mean the manufacturers don't need to hit in these first couple of years the headline targets that often make their way into the media. So these flexibilities were introduced into the legislation at the request of industry less than a year ago, and now they're going back to the government for additional flexibilities. And actually, the trajectory towards this kind of environment has been set for some time. I think we can talk more broadly, however, about sort of demand for electric vehicles. And there's obviously the kind of headline things that would cost government money around targeted grants or something similar. But there's even small things that Green Alliance and others have been calling on for some time that can help assure prospective new buyers of electric vehicles that they're making the right decision. So, for example, the idea of the right to plug, so that leaseholders and renters have the opportunity to charge at home and benefit from those cheaper prices compared to public charging, cutting VAT on public chargers to bring those upfront prices down, which are getting a bit expensive right now. There's a whole range of things supporting battery health to assure consumers that their batteries are going to last for a number of years. And there's a whole range of measures we'd really like to engage on government here, but it is so crucial that they do not chop and change again with the regulatory environment and tinker around with the ZEV mandate. That should be here to stay, as it is such a crucial element of our climate goals.
Over recent years, we've seen a growth in the use of vans for deliveries, and emissions from heavy goods vehicles are remaining stubbornly high because the transition hasn't really been picking up pace in that area yet. What more can the government be doing to ensure these vehicles transition to lower carbon alternatives?
Yeah, I think you've really stuck on a major point. Cars is obviously the biggest part in terms of emissions, but you need to consider vans and you need to consider heavy goods vehicles. Both are in a slightly different position. Vans do have a sort of ZEV mandate regulation in the same way as cars do. So they have a trajectory to 100% sales of electric vehicles in 2035. And actually, there is a phase-out date for the smaller side of heavy goods vehicles as well, which is 2035. And actually, also the very largest, that has been pushed back a little to 2040. But the good thing on those phase-out dates is it has sort of set a marker for heavy goods vehicle phase-out that's actually slightly more ambitious than the European Union's, which is really good to see. Now, the challenge is we need to sort of work with van users, those small businesses, to get over the teething issues around using vans. We need to get more models onto the market so it can help drive down the price, make sure that we deal with payload issues, etc., so that they can really make this transition confidently, so that they don't feel like they're sort of being penalized from their business perspective. So there is more that needs to be done. The government should guarantee the low emission plug-in grant for vans. There is still a position to support vans and heavy goods vehicles when it comes to the financial element to this. And actually, when it comes to heavy goods vehicles, the biggest thing ultimately has to be, it needs to have that certainty of a trajectory as we've seen in the car and van market. So again, probably a ZEV mandate or a similar type of regulation that helps to set out the course for this trajectory, because those hauliers, those businesses who are engaging in the freight sector aren't sure what way it's going to go. There's even discussions around the sort of technological solutions. Are we going to be going more towards an electrification way, or are we going to be going towards hydrogen? And there are things here that the government needs to clarify, that it really should push forward with an electric first wherever possible, and then only considering the alternative technologies for the longest and the heaviest types of vehicles that may not be suited to electrification. But getting that ZEV mandate in place is really that cornerstone policy, and then we can build the sort of suitable policy around it to help further that transition.
What can government be doing to actually boost that demand for EVs and ensure that the sales growth continues at the rate it has been?
There's actually a lot of things that the government can do, and they don't have to be the big fiscal implications of grants for EVs. Actually, a lot of us in the world of EV policy don't think that's necessarily needed at this stage. There's things around accelerating the growth of charging, which is actually doing relatively well at this stage, but could be doing better. There's an inequality between different regions. So if you look at London, if you look at Scotland, if you look at Wales, they're doing relatively well on the charging rollout, but actually the public charging in places in the north, for example, or in Northern Ireland have been doing less well. So there's work to be done there. There's also some small interventions such as tweaking planning rules that the government could choose to do, and that could allow more people to access at-home charging, because there's actually a big inequality, unfortunately, at the heart of electric vehicles, and that is that those with driveways who can install home chargers, they can benefit from much cheaper rates to fuel their car, whereas those who don't have that have to charge from public chargers, which are unfortunately far more expensive. So the government could also consider cutting the VAT on public charging, which is currently set at 20%, but actually your VAT level on your electricity used at home is 5%, so that's a big inequality that the government could help to support. And there's a range of things they could do, from supporting regulations on the quality of the charging experience so that people know when they go to a charger it will be easy to use, it will be universal contactless payment, a whole range of things. And actually the good thing is that the government is already starting to take some of these messages on board. The final thing I'd say is that we also need to sort of tackle the messaging around this. So we started this conversation talking about the sort of mixed messaging that's come out of car manufacturers, and actually we're asking the government to do a little bit more just to convene those voices that actually cut through on what EVs can do. It is an enjoyable experience to drive if you're passionate about driving. It's much quieter, it's comfortable. Actually, your running costs are often much cheaper. If you look over the total cost of ownership of an EV, it's usually cheaper than a petrol or diesel car. So there's a whole range of benefits that switching to electric vehicles can bring, and we just want the government to do that bit more to really champion this agenda.
I'm here with Rosie Allen, Policy Advisor at Green Alliance. Rosie, things are really moving fast on clean transport at the moment. Can you tell us about some of the things that you're most excited about?
In Leeds, Tracy Brabin, the mayor, has announced that there's going to be a tram system. And for too long, Leeds has been the biggest city in Europe without a mass transport network. So that's a really exciting development that we're looking forward to seeing. And we're going to see Trans-Pennine route upgrades across that rail connectivity in the north. And so that is also something to really look forward to. And in terms of technology, we're seeing really exciting developments in terms of battery technology. So soon we'll hear that it will be possible to charge up an electric vehicle in about the same amount of time that it currently takes to fill it up with petrol. And if we're thinking locally, local to me in London, there's going to be trials of solar powering parts of the tube soon. So we're hearing that the district line won't be the only green line on the tube in time to come. Alongside pantograph charging, that's going to mean really fast bus charging through futuristic tram-like buses that have a lever that come to charge it from the top. And so there's lots of exciting movements happening in transport at the moment.
We've had a budget recently that's impacted bus fares and continued the freeze on fossil fuel duty. And we've also got some big bills coming up in Parliament. So I want to talk to you about that. So taking the budget first, what are your key takeaways for transport?
So there was some good news and some bad news for transport in the budget. On fuel duty, the emergency cut introduced during the energy crisis and the 13-year freeze were maintained. But at the same time, the bus fare cap went up by 50% to £3 and rail fares were increased above inflation. And we can understand that people need protection in light of the ongoing cost of living crisis when we're thinking about that fuel duty freeze. But it's a shame that that protection is only extended to drivers and didn't affect public transport users in the same way. I was disappointed to see the bus fare cap being increased to £3, but we would at least like to see this maintained for the rest of the Parliament. And it's encouraging that Andy Burnham in Greater Manchester has pledged to maintain the fare cap at £2. And Tracy Brabin in West Yorkshire has suggested that they might maintain a cap at £2.50. And leading into budget day, we were hearing that there was risk of the cap being scrapped completely. So it's a relief to seeing that protection for passengers maintained in some form. And it's good that the announcement came with just under £1 billion for local bus networks, because we really need to see those routes returned, as they've really suffered in recent years, particularly outside of cities and rural places. On rail, I know you're going to speak to Campaign for Better Transport later on that, but it was disappointing to see that prices are going to rise above inflation next year. And on Active Travel, there was some good news. We did see £100 million of new funding announced, which is great, but it doesn't quite match the ambition that we were hoping to see.
We know that transport is the highest emitting sector, and you're working on some analysis at the moment on how we can close the gap between current policies and where we need to be to meet our carbon budgets. Can you tell us a bit about that work?
It's been really fun to be a part of this work and this amazing overview of the whole transport system and looking where there's potential for emissions reductions across the whole transport piece. I think the biggest takeaway for me is the Zero Emission Vehicle mandate. So that's a requirement for more and more new car sales to be electric over the coming years. And it's currently under pressure. So we need to make sure that that is delivered and there's no backsliding on the commitments made there. But the lesson is that the Zero Emission Vehicle mandate isn't going to be enough on its own. There are lots of areas that have been neglected historically. So in terms of heavy goods vehicles and shipping, how we get our freight around, those often haven't seen the progress that we need to see. And what we ought to be looking forward to in the future is changes across the whole piece of the way that we travel. But the good news is that it's generally going to involve making our public transport better and our air cleaner.
Last week was a big week for transport news. Can you tell us a bit about that, Rosie?
Yeah, absolutely. So we're hearing a lot of really good intentions from this government on transport at the moment. It was really great to hear about the transport strategy taking inspiration from Dijon, which is a small city. It's about equivalent to the size of York or Chester in the UK. And it has buses running about every 5 minutes during rush hour and really well-connected tram system. That could mean really good inspiration for trams and better bus frequency here in the UK in smaller cities. It was also really great to hear about a people-led approach being taken, which is great to see, and a call for evidence announced alongside the announcement of the strategy so that we can see how people can have their input there. Ultimately, it's really good to remember that better public transport means cleaner air, less congestion, and a livable planet in the future. Plus, our Mind the Gap analysis shows that aligning bus and train timetables could prevent as much as pollution each year as taking 177,000 cars off the road. So it's great to hear a great vision for transport, but we're looking forward to seeing that backed up by the Treasury in the new year with the comprehensive spending review as well.
I'm pleased to be joined by Campaign for Better Transport's Head of Campaigns, Michael Solomon-Williams. Some will assume that switching to electric vehicles is all we need to do to transition to a sustainable transport system. What would Campaign for Better Transport say to that?
We hear the phrase silver bullet a lot, and it's worth emphasising that silver bullet is not what the transition to electric vehicles is. It's an important part of the picture, certainly, because emissions from internal combustion engines have played a huge part in the situation we find ourselves in currently. So it's very, very important that we do transition to electric vehicles as part of the process. We know from the World Resources Institute that what we need to be doing to mitigate against the worst impact of the climate emergency is in fact build public transport networks at 6 times the current rate. So that's really what we need to be focusing on. Now, I'm conscious that we do have a bit of a case study of bad press for building public transport networks in this country. Obviously, that's HS2. That hasn't necessarily helped our cause in terms of making the case for building more rail networks. But we really do have to find a way to focus on that as the priority, building more public transport networks.
So we've got a world-class public transport network in London where people don't have to rely on owning a car already. How can we extend that same quality of public transport provision across the whole of the country and do that in that rapid way that you just talked about? And what benefits would that bring if we did it?
Well, I think it's really interesting if we look at the situation in 2024 where London is one of the most expensive places to live in the UK, yet the cost of public transport is the lowest in the UK. Flip back just 100 years and London was not expensive to live in. What we need to do to get to a similar stage across the country is certainly bring down the cost of building mass transit networks. So we need to see tram systems, we need to see light rail systems. There have been cases made for underground systems in other parts of the UK. Those that don't have them don't necessarily need them. Bristol is a case in point. They've been looking for a while at either an underground or a tram-style metro system. What we really need to see is more cities to have those metro systems. I mean, you look to Europe because people in cities across the UK feel that they're really left behind because they don't have that access to straightforward, affordable, indeed accessible public transport systems. So I think we're talking at Campaign for Better Transport increasingly about the importance of tram networks. The challenge we've had in the UK is that we have deemed them to be too expensive when in fact they aren't. And if you go to Bordeaux and you build a tram network, everyone says, hooray, fantastic, that'll improve our quality of life. If you try to do that in Barnsley or somewhere in the UK, they might say, oh, that'll be disruptive. We're sort of culturally prepared to object to the disruption of building something we actually need. And as I say, HS2 is a kind of macro example of that challenge. So we really need to have a kind of step change in terms of our understanding of the importance of these urban transport networks. And that's something that at Campaign for Better Transport, we're working very hard to do.
You just talked about the importance of affordability, but we heard from the Chancellor at the end of October that fuel duty is frozen for the 14th year in a row, while train fares are rising more than inflation and the bus fare cap is going to go up by £1. What's your take on the budget?
Well, I think it's a good point that you raised this issue, because it's possible for us in our sector, we're at Campaign for Better Transport, we're Green Alliance, we're the people who are affecting policy often in a very positive way, and we're working closely with and supporting government departments to do the right thing. And there are many good things in the budget in terms of East-West Rail and West Yorkshire Mass Transit, HS2 getting to Euston, but what the public see is, how much does it cost me to take a train? How much does it cost me to take a bus? So the majority of the public's interpretation of the government's priorities on public transport are, train fares are going up again, bus fares are going up by 50%, and indeed rail cards are going up. This is a detail which wasn't mentioned in the budget but is in the papers. Rail cards, which have been £30, most rail cards for the last 10 years, are going up by £5. There are decisions like that which really raise some questions about how seriously government prioritises public transport as a key solution to the climate emergency. At Campaign for Better Transport, we are calling for a fares freeze on rail fares. The bus fare cap, I should say, is an interesting one. There are some nuances to it, and we certainly successfully campaigned for the £2 fare cap in the first place. That was hugely successful. So to an extent, we've had a situation outside of London where it's been unusually affordable and simple for people to take the bus. We're cautiously glad that there's still a cap of sorts, and indeed £3 bus fares will be a lot cheaper in some rural areas for long distance journeys than they would otherwise have been. But what the public sees is, they're going up by 50%. Why is that happening? We need to be really getting a bit more serious about those pricing signals and what the public sees as government's priorities on public transport.
The government is currently bringing forward a Better Buses bill and also a bill to reform rail services. What would you like to see the government tackle in these pieces of legislation?
In the Better Buses bill, we'd like to see a minimum service level of bus provision guaranteed. What we haven't had for a long time is real recognition of how disproportionately some areas are affected. So the bus provision across the country has been extremely patchy. And indeed, although it was good news that we managed to get bus service improvement plans through and get some funding over the past few years for buses, which is continuing with £1 billion for buses, it's a nice kind of headline, they have up until now been bid for competitively. And so those areas least able to put together successful bids have suffered the most. So there's been a kind of exacerbation of inequality in that sense. We're very, very pleased, I should say, in the Better Buses bill to hear that that's been changed. So actually those areas most in need are getting more targeted funding from the extension of the BSIPs, the Bus Service Improvement Plan. However, what we do still need to see is a guarantee of a minimum socially and economically necessary service of bus provision. We're calling for a national standard for bus stop provision. So that's the infrastructure, the information provided at bus stops. And we believe that's something which could really get the public to believe in buses in a fresh way. And it wouldn't necessarily be about extra funding. It would be about having those standards, about making sure that buses aren't the poor relation with trains and trams, as they have been for far too long. The point we're making on this front is that the smallest and the least served railway station in the UK, that's Mould in Flintshire, has about 1 train an hour, and still it's got digital real-time information. It's got a printed timetable. It's got comfortable seating. You think of some of the more used bus stops around the country, some of them don't even have printed timetables. I mean, it's really, really haphazard. And so that interface between people on walking down the street and choosing to take a public or a private transport mode, it's not really sufficient. So just having those standards, we believe, will encourage a much better relationship between the public and buses in the years to come.
So if we're going to grow passengers, we'll obviously need some investment in that infrastructure. The government's in the middle of a comprehensive spending review at the moment. Where would you like to see the government targeting its investment on transport?
I think investment on transport needs to be targeted in long-term ring-fence funding for Buses, certainly, they are at the moment. They're the most used form of public transport. So we've got BSIP funding guarantees for another year, but we need that to be longer term and ring-fenced. And we also need funds from the Ministry of Housing, Communities and Local Government, some of which are currently used for buses, to be kept within DFT. We need funds also to be more equally distributed across the country. So the north of England, per head, has received less than half the funding that people in the southeast have received for public transport. So we need much more equitable distribution of funding. We need to ensure also in the Planning and Infrastructure Bill that there is committed capital funding for transport networks. If you have new developments or expanded developments, there's a real risk that well-meaning target for new towns and housing development and a £1.5 million house building target, there's a real risk that if there is not capital committed within that, we'll see car dependency simply continue to be encouraged.
We know also that there's progress where we need to make in making sure that everyone can use stations, trains and buses. What more would you like to see the government do to improve accessibility on public transport?
I'd like to talk about three elements of accessibility. The first is getting to a station in the first place. And we've done work on transport deserts in the past, which looks at towns of between 5 and 30,000 people. 15 million people live in such towns. That's a quarter of the population. Again, 15 million people suffer from some form of disability or mobility impairment. That's another quarter of the population. So actually, there's a huge challenge for many people in getting to a railway station or a part of the public transport network. When they do, there's then the challenge of getting from the street to the platform level. And 3 out of 4 stations are not properly step-free. That's a huge problem. Then when you get to the platform, if you're lucky enough to have got there, only 2% of stations in the UK have level boarding. That's from platform to train. There are some exceptions. If we can carry on at the same rate as we are currently, it'll take us 100 years for the entire network to be accessible. We're doing very, very badly, both on Access for All, which is step-free, and on level boarding, there isn't a plan. We need to start immediately a national plan, a continuous process. We're talking here about a platform height standard across the UK and making adjustments where necessary. But there currently effectively is no rolling programme, there is no target in sight. So I'm really glad you asked this question. Accessibility is key. Of course, that first stage of accessibility, getting to the network, involves building more networks, expanding existing networks and building fresh networks. The second stage involves doing a lot better on Access for All. Now, we may see that happen with the formation of GBR because Access for All is within Network Rail's remit. And the third stage, in terms of level boarding, we need to talk about it more like we are today, and we need there to be a rolling programme as soon as possible because it'll take a very long time, but it's vital. So thank you for raising those points.
How much potential do you see in the new government's agenda on public transport?
I think there's a lot of potential. I think one of the best things that's happening at the moment is this integrated national transport strategy. We've been feeding into this, as have others in our sector. There's a lot of cause for optimism. This integrated strategy could offer something very exciting. I think then it's just making the link between what they're doing, what they believe in, and Treasury priorities, and really getting that Green Book rewritten. We're on the right track in terms of talking about the right things, prioritising the right things. So yes, although the public-facing stuff, some of the pricing signals have not been great, I think medium term there's genuine cause for optimism.
Well, I have the great pleasure of welcoming the cycling journalist and author Laura Laker to join us on the Green Alliance podcast. In your book, Potholes and Pavements, you took a bumpy ride around Britain's national cycle network. What did you find?
As a cycling journalist, I was interested in the difference between the way that, say, roads and rail are funded and managed and the way that cycle routes are funded and managed. And anyone who's tried to cycle around the UK will know that in towns and cities and outside, it's just very, very patchy. Where National Roads and the National Rail have bodies that receive multi-year funding and manage the network. For the National Cycle Network, it's run by a charity and maintained by volunteers, basically, because there's no maintenance funding. And so, yeah, I was interested in why this was the case and what it meant on the ground.
How can we change this patchy, underfunded and volunteer-run network that you found and actually make it part of our sort of strategic national transport infrastructure? And do you think that's what's needed?
Yeah, I do. There's some wonderful bits of the National Cycle Network, and I used it in the book as a proxy for cycle routes in general, because the National Cycle Network is it's a bit like the national highways, the roads body. They're sort of the trunk roads, if you like, that connect into urban areas. And then local networks tend to be built by councils and regional mayoral bodies, and in Scotland the transport, and Wales transport's devolved. So yeah, I mean, we know that the cycling is hugely beneficial for our health and for the economy, and we know that we're now kind of the sick person of Europe again, and cycling unlocks a lot of transport options for people, especially people on low incomes and people who kind of who just have travel short journeys and don't want the expense of a car. I think it needs to be funded properly. Multi-year funding is really, really important for any transport or any infrastructure at all. I was speaking to the CEO of Sostrans, the charity that runs the National Cycle Network, a few weeks ago, and he was saying, you couldn't even build an extension on a year's funding certainty, and yet that's what delivery bodies building cycle routes are expected to do. And so it needs that multi-year funding so that organisations, whoever runs the network, can plan and consult and design and then build and then plan the next bit. The cycling walk investment strategies were supposed to deliver this multi-year funding, and then they sort of got undercut. So unlike road investment strategy, they are now kind of, the funding was deemed, it wasn't kind of ring fenced. That was the interpretation, and it really just needs to be treated in the same way that other transport modes are and taken seriously.
What scope do you think there is under the new government to tackle this and improve Britain's national cycle network and the cycle routes that we have in our towns and cities?
Yeah, I mean, they have all the powers that we need to build cycle routes. Cycle routes aren't complicated things. It's not as complicated as a motorway, for example, but it does need to be done well.
So we saw 100 million pledged to active travel in the current budget. Is that the kind of money that we need to be seeing, or?
No. It's nowhere near. I think transport campaigners would say we need at least 10% of the transport budget to be spent on walking and cycling. It needs to be every year. The government's analysis of the cycling walk investment strategy said we need between 5 and 8 billion to deliver the kind of journeys by the targets that government has set to get journeys by walking and cycling by 2035. Or, interestingly, that goes down to between 3 and 5 billion if we start to restrict motor traffic. So we start to restrict rat running in local streets, for example, because you can't build cycle lanes everywhere. So it's about kind of managing it smartly. But no, £100 million, and it's just for a year, is nowhere near. You really need that long-term funding. And the good news is we've got the budget coming up in the spring, the spending review. So that's a real opportunity for the government to start talking, and the integrated transport strategy and cycling walking investment strategy. CWIS 3 is due imminently because the CWIS 2 runs out in March. So these are all opportunities for the government to start doing the right thing around active travel, because we know that we're not going to be able to decarbonise transport unless we start looking at active modes.
You mentioned the integrated transport strategy there. What would you like to be seeing in that?
I think integrating cycling into other modes of transport is really, really valuable and really important. If you can get someone to the train station by a bike or on foot, and cycling increases the kind of catchment area of a train station or a public transport node by around 10 times, then you can potentially take out a much longer car journey. But, it needs to be that the whole journey is reliable. At the moment, people can't rely on the rail network because there's not enough staff, there's constant cancellations, trains are late, they're overcrowded. So the whole kind of experience needs to be easy. And we've seen in the Netherlands, everyone cycles to the train station. The bike parking is enormous. They build these great big underground kind of car parks, but for bikes. So, being able to integrate public transport in that way is really, really powerful. And there also needs to be funding for devolved governments and for mayoral authorities in order that they can deliver, because some of the greatest improvements in cycling infrastructure have been in the mayoral regions. So we've got the Greater Manchesters. Andy Street, the former mayor of the West Midlands, delivered some great stuff and had some great plans. Now it's Richard Parker, and hopefully he'll do the same, although he seems to be having a much slower start. So these are really the regions, and London, of course, being an obvious example. If they can have the kind of long-term funding and the integration of transport that Andy Burnham's trying to do in Manchester with public transport, and have the powers to make those decisions, then you can really start to see improvements and people getting out of their cars and choosing other options.
Do metro mayors and combined authorities have the powers at the moment? What's lacking there?
They just don't have the kind of funds at the moment, and they have to bid for funding. Then it's about getting maintenance funding, because that's something that's quite often lacking with active travel routes. And then they don't get to choose, for example, where new homes are built. So the government's got this plan to build lots of new homes, new towns, a lot of which will be kind of bolted onto the edge of city kind of areas. And you need to be able to decide as a mayor where those are going to go. And so they link up to transport nodes. And at the moment, mayors don't have that power to do that. And so it means that something could still be built, as we have been building, it's a huge mistake, building outside of towns where there's no public transport. We're not building the public transport that people need. We're not building the walking and cycling links. And so people are being trapped into car ownership. They're moving into these new homes. You can't even go to the shop without your car. So they need those powers to be able to decide what goes where, and to say to developers, look, you need to be building near this new train station that we're building, or near this cycling route and bus route.
Do you think the government should be putting some of that guidance into their reforms to the planning system and to the national planning policy framework?
Yeah, I think that all needs to be considered when we're building new homes. And at the moment, with new homes, there's quite often a disincentive to councils to build cycle routes into new developments because it's seen as an extra maintenance cost long term, just because of the way that things have always been done. It's just a road. That's all you get. And even if a developer has great ideas around active travel, they want to build a cycle link to the nearest town, then quite often council officers pushing back because they say, well, there's adoptable standards, they're called, and actually we can't take on this extra liability. And so it's really a kind of systemic thing that needs changing.
You've cycled all over Europe. Where in Europe is getting it right when it comes to safe and convenient cycling infrastructure, and what can we learn from them here?
I know that there's a great example around Copenhagen. So a few years ago, they decided to invest in a kind of inter-urban network of routes that they call cycle superhighways. And they're sort of smooth, direct, well-signed, well-lit routes that connect the kind of surrounding towns to Copenhagen. And it turned out to be the sort of greatest infrastructure investment ever made. And much of the benefits were in health, but people are travelling, sort of 12, 15 miles on average along these routes. And I think that was a great example of where the city government had an idea to do something, and the regional governments surrounding, the other kind of councils surrounding the city, got behind this idea and put their money behind it, and they all kind of got together. And I think that's what's kind of been missing here, is that kind of strategic, joined up thinking.
So what's the biggest barrier at the moment to getting more people on their bike for everyday journeys?
It's an easy one. It's basically people don't want to share the roads with traffic. We saw during the pandemic what happens when you get rid of the cars on the road, and people took up cycling. One of the reasons certainly was because it felt safe. And then when the cars come back, people stop cycling because they don't want to have to share. And we know that for women particularly, sharing with motor traffic is particularly off-putting, and that's why for every one woman that cycles, there's 3 men. That's why we have such a gender disparity in cycling in the UK. We need to have either low traffic, slow traffic streets where cycles have priority and are respected, or protected routes on main roads, or off-road routes. But you can't mix high volumes, high speed traffic with people cycling, because, someone will have one bad experience and then they'll just stop. And that's, when people tell me they're too afraid to cycle in this country, I tell them, well, you're normal, to be honest, because that's the experience of most people. They don't want to, they've got every right to be afraid. You've got a couple of tons of vehicle coming at you, even at 30 miles an hour. That's pretty scary.
Thank you for listening to this Green Alliance podcast focused on transport. Keep checking in as we'll continue to bring you regular specialist interviews, policy news and highlights from our events here. You can subscribe on your favourite podcast app, and you can follow us at Green Alliance UK on X and Green Alliance on LinkedIn and Blue Sky. We encourage you to use the hashtag Green Alliance Podcast to join in on this conversation and share thoughts, questions and ideas. See you next time.